Okay. All right. Well, welcome. We're really excited to have you here today. So thanks for carving out some time in your afternoon to spend with us. Just to make sure you're in the right spot, this is teaching 8th grade US history. So if you thought this was a math session, now will be the time to log out of the Zoom. So this is our first session of an 11 session series. And today's is the only one that is 3 hours because we're going to do some intro to the course and give you sort of a snapshot of the big picture as well as Unit 1. And then from here on out, the sessions are all just an hour and a half. So this is the long one today, but it's going to be good. So get ready. I am Molly Gale. I'm this one. I'm one of the social studies consultants at Oakland Schools, and I'm particularly excited to be here today because I taught high school for a couple of years, and then I moved to middle school, and I taught 8th grade US history for 11 years. So I love this course, and I'm just really passionate about it and excited to be with all of you. And I'll toss it off to Stacy.
Hi, everybody. I'm Stacy Woodward. I am also a social studies consultant at Oakland Schools, and I've worked with Molly on this course and designing it, and I'm so happy you're here to learn about it. We think you're going to love it.
And Chris Lee, who is also a social studies consultant at Oakland Schools, could not be here today, but he will be at the future session. So you will see him in about a month. Okay, so we have a lot to do in 3 hours. That's really sort of the quick snapshot of the agenda. But to give you just an idea of where we're headed over the next few hours, we are going to share with you the revisions process that we went through for the 8th grade course, as well as the larger revisions process for the MC3 curriculum. We're going to introduce some of the scaffolds for the course that are built into it, so you recognize them when you see them. We're going to take a look at the course overview and the pacing guide, which are a little bit different than the prior course. And then we'll start diving into Unit 1. So we'll do an overview of Unit 1, and you'll have a chance to look through the lesson abstracts to get a feel for what you'll be doing the first few weeks of the course. And then we'll dig a little deeper into the actual Unit 1 lessons. We'll take a short break because I think at that point everyone will need one. And then we'll come back and do a disciplinary reading activity so you can get a feel for some of the things the kids are going to be doing. And at that point, we're very excited to have with us today Jeremy Nessoff, who is here from Facing History and Ourselves. And he has an amazing presentation planned for you to talk about Facing History, as well as some amazing resources to start the school year. And he's going to talk a little bit about the Reconstruction unit that's coming up in Unit 10. And then we'll wrap up, talk about next steps, and we will definitely be out of here by 3 o'clock. And I will tell you just really quickly, you will get the slide deck at the end. So if there's anything you see, don't feel like you have to scramble to write it, because we'll give you the full slide deck. And everything within the slide deck is hyperlinked, and you'll also have access to all those hyperlinks. But we do want to make sort of a quick disclaimer, which is that what we really wanted was this to be like a 13-hour session to fit in everything we wanted to talk about and share with you. But unfortunately, it's only 3. So we are going to do our best to give you a kind of a bird's eye view of the changes and the course and Unit 1. But we definitely are not going to be able to hit everything. So you'll certainly want to carve out some time in the next few weeks to look through Unit 1 in a little more depth and look at the lesson level. But as we move, if you have any questions as we're going, please don't hesitate to pop them in the chat, and Stacy and I will answer them as they come in. So we know we're going to move quickly, and we apologize for that in advance. So the first thing we want to do is actually have you grab either a piece of paper that you have near you, or if you have your computer open, obviously you have your computer open, feel free to open a tab and open a doc, but we'd like you to do some journaling. So we're going to give you 2 minutes, and I'll keep the time. And we just want you to do a quick write. What does the phrase "we the people" mean to you? And once you've thought about that, reflect on what connections can you make to it. So I'm going to start the timer, and we'll meet back in 2 minutes. All right, you have about 20 seconds to wrap up your thoughts. So finish that sentence you're on. Okay. Is anyone willing to unmute and just tell us a little, you don't have to read it word for word, but just tell us a little bit about what you were thinking about as you were writing. Or if you'd prefer, you can also pop it in the chat.
Hi.
Thanks, Kim. Hi.
Hi. One thing I said in my journaling was when I hear that phrase, we the people, it just reminds me that we're all in this together, that we part, and that we really need to work as a group and sometimes compromise to move us forward. So I really focused on that we part, and I think that connects because of current events and the great kind of divide that we're having right now is my kind of connection that kind of made me focus maybe a little more on that we part of the phrase.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. And I see Scott put in the chat community. So it sounds like a similar line of thinking to Kim. Can we maybe just have one more person unmute and share?
I'll share what I have.
Hi, Michelle. Thanks.
Hi. I had a lot of what Kim had, but I also added that it doesn't even matter what the topic is in particular. There's a common sense of belonging. It's just that comfort that everybody feels.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. So this is actually a journal prompt that your students will do very early in the course. The We the People journals are the journals that the kids actually keep throughout the entire course. So the kids are journaling and returning to them every lesson, every unit throughout the course. And Jeremy will talk a little bit later about the role of journaling in the course and why it's important. But really the kids' journals are a place for them to brainstorm, to reflect, to process sometimes some of the difficult concepts that you're going to talk about. And they're also just a place for the kids to take some risks and to practice some writing strategies. So we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but one thing we would encourage you to do is to build some time in at the very beginning of the year to have kids decorate their journals. So it's a great activity on those opening days to give the kids some ownership of these because they are going to be using them every day for the whole year. So this is a beautifully decorated one we have there, but it doesn't have to look just like that. All right, so as we move forward into the rest of the session today, we just have a few norms and commitments for our time together. And again, Jeremy is going to talk a little bit more later about establishing norms and commitments with your students. But these are ours for today. So we're just going to give you a second to read through them and just think about one or two that you'd like to focus on, and you don't have to share it out loud or in the chat, just for yourself. All right, so hopefully you've had a chance to think about one or two that you're going to focus on today. So we want to start by really giving you kind of a snapshot into where the 8th grade course fits into the larger process of the MC3 revisions. The MC3, which is our affectionate name for the Michigan Citizenship Collaborative Curriculum, and you can see why we have a nickname for it. So the MC3 is a full K-12 social studies curriculum. And it's accessed and housed through the Atlas system. So when you hear people talk about like, oh, I use Atlas, they're really talking about MC3, which is the curriculum, and Atlas houses it. But the MC3 curriculum was originally created as a response to the first social studies standards that came out years ago. And what we're starting to do now is go through and progressively revise the courses. As you all know, we had the 2019 standards come out, and what better time to revise the curriculum than now? So 8th grade was the first one that we revised. And you can see right here, we revised it over the course of last year. And some of you, I think, were probably already using it last year. We rolled out the units as they were completed. But now, of course, the whole thing is ready to go for the beginning of this school year. The 8th grade course is fully aligned now to the 2019 standards. It's also aligned to the C3 framework, as well as the Common Core. So we've aligned it to all of those things. And now what we are doing is we're heading into work on revising the 5th grade course. So we're actually hopping down to elementary now because the 6th and 7th grade courses were the most recently written. So they're actually fairly new. So now that 8th grade has been revised, we're moving down to elementary and working our way down from 5th grade to 4th grade and so on. So if you have any friends who teach 5th grade, that course is actually now published on Atlas. It has the pacing guide as well as the first unit. And then throughout the fall and early winter, we're going to publish the remaining units on a rolling basis. And of course, this year now, we are going to be running this monthly series just ahead of the time you'll be teaching that unit. So today we'll talk about unit 1. And when we meet in September, we'll talk about unit 2, so that we're just always slightly ahead of where you are in your teaching. So that's sort of our big picture. The other thing I would just remind you of as we head into this is the MC3 is written purposely for a first-year teacher or a long-term sub. And by that, I mean, we write these lessons very, very explicitly and very step-by-step. So if you pick up a lesson plan and you're like, oh my gosh, this is the longest lesson plan I've ever seen in my life. It's because our intention is that a long-term sub who happens to show up in the room at 7 a.m. could pick the lesson plan up and actually teach a meaningful lesson throughout the week. So just keep that in mind as we roll. Okay. So the new course, which we're going to give you a chance to dig into in a minute. When you log into Atlas, and we'll do this together in just a little bit, we have the pacing guide for the course. And when you click into each unit, so when you click unit 1, for instance, it will launch that specific unit. And you'll see that there is a lesson sequence within each unit that includes a lesson plan, the supplemental materials for that lesson. So that's everything you need to teach the lesson. There's no other materials you need, and a slide deck. Excuse me. So one of the changes in this revised curriculum is we have a lesson plan, supplemental materials, and a slide deck for every lesson. The other thing that is important to know when we start looking at the new units is that the 8th grade course is now updated to Google. So all of the lesson plans are in Google Docs and all of the slide decks are in Google Slides. So hopefully this makes it a little more accessible and easy to use. So one of the big changes we made as we went through these revisions is that we kept in mind that we have the C3 framework. So we're very focused in this course on centering it around inquiry. So asking questions and having kids investigate questions. So within the course, there's actually a series of questions. There's a course compelling question. So this is a big overarching compelling question that the kids are actually investigating every unit throughout the entire course, that they will finally come and create an argument to at the very end of the year in June. There's also a unit compelling question. So every unit is framed with a compelling question that the kids are investigating throughout each lesson. And at the end of the unit, they come back and form an argument to that question. And then we have lesson level questions. So every day that the kids are engaged in a lesson, they're actually focused on answering a specific lesson question that's central to that topic. So the questions in the course sort of nest within each other, if you will, hence the really fun nesting doll image there. So the course compelling question, the question that the kids are looking at throughout the course is this: how should we tell the stories of America? So I'll give you a second just to think about that question. And then if you can just drop some initial reactions to that in the chat. Thanks, Christina. Yeah. Oh, the Hamilton knowledge is being dropped. I love it. Alicia, okay, too broad. Yeah, and it is purposely broad. Looking at impact. Okay. So we have the course compelling question. And then at the unit level, every unit is framed with a compelling question. So this is an example of a unit compelling question from later in the course. This is the unit that's addressing all of the events leading up to the Civil War. And the question is, can a divided nation be united? So that is the compelling question that students are investigating throughout that unit and coming up with an answer to. Now, in order for a question to be compelling, it has to not only drive the student's exploration, but it has to be debatable. So all of these unit compelling questions are debatable, and they have to be able to be supported with evidence. So there's no leading questions where we're looking for one right answer from kids and there's really no way to argue the other side. The other thing they need to be is they have to be intellectually rigorous. So they have to be questions that are real, that kids really have to think about and support. And they're not hypotheticals. So these are not going to be questions like, you know, if you were a colonist, what would you have done? So they're real authentic questions that people in the discipline are still grappling with. And a lot of the questions at the unit level, you'll notice, are questions that historians right now are grappling with. So we're trying to bring kids into that authentic work of the discipline. Every lesson, kids progressively return to that unit compelling question and start to process it and develop an argument. And then each unit ends with a summative performance task. So at the end of each unit, there's an opportunity for kids to actually craft an argument that takes a variety of different forms, and actually answer that unit question and support it with evidence. So then at the lesson level, each lesson is then also framed with a question. So this is a sample lesson question, just to give you a feel for it. This is from Unit 7. The unit compelling question in Unit 7 is, why did the Civil War break out when it did? And the lesson level question, and this is the lesson that's looking at, for instance, the Fugitive Slave Act. The lesson question is it ever okay to break the law? And the kids work for a couple of days to grapple with that question in its historical context, as well as its contemporary one. And at the end of the lesson, they write an argument to that question. And you can see one reason the kids are keeping these We the People journals throughout every lesson of the course is the journals are a place for them to continually come back to brainstorm and process and start to gather evidence. So when they get to the end of a lesson or they get to the end of a unit, they can go back to their journals and pull out some of that evidence to craft their arguments. Okay, so we're going to break you into an anatomy of a lesson. So at the lesson level, which is of course where we're all starting, every lesson within the course has the lesson plan, which is really for you, of course. It has the supplemental materials. This would be anything that the kids need. So these would be things that you're going to be running copies of, or if you're a one-to-one district, these are docs you may be dropping into whatever digital management system you're using, but these are the things for the kids. And then the slide deck. And the slide decks really do have everything we think you would need to project as a large class for the kids. So you shouldn't really have to go out and create any of this on your own. It's meant to be completely user-friendly, ready to roll. It's also, though, intended to be adapted. So all of this can be changed and adapted for whatever needs you have in your own classroom. So we're going to zero in on the lesson plans. So the lesson plans, which are in Google Docs within the whole curriculum, they all are framed with the lesson question. This is the lesson. These examples are pulled from this lesson question is, did ideas about immigrants live up to the nation's ideals? So the kids look at the nation's ideals, they look at what was happening with immigration, and they craft an argument about whether they think the ideas about immigrants were living up to the nation's ideals at the time. The lesson always has at the very top the big ideas. So these are like, if we had to boil the lesson down into 3, 4, or 5 bullet points, that's the big ideas right there. And then it has the lesson abstract, and the lesson abstract is really for you. It's the quick sort of, I have 2 minutes, I need to skim through and see what I'm actually doing with the kids over the course of this lesson, whether it's, 1, 2, or 3 days. This will give you an idea of all of the activities embedded in the lesson and what you're going to be doing with the kids. The lesson plans always have the key concepts that are addressed. And then probably what you're most interested in is the lesson sequence. So this is that step-by-step plan. One shift we have made in the revised curriculum is that we've broken it down into sort of like subheaders now. So at a glance, it's easy to see the breaks for activities. So it might say like direct instruction, and then you'll have a sequence of several steps. It might say like Socratic circle, and then a series of steps. So when you look at it, you'll see these bold headers that sort of show you how the lesson is chunked. The end of the lesson plan always has all of the standards that are aligned to that lesson. So if you need to cite them for anything or you need to refer to them, they are there. And again, it's aligned to the content standards for Michigan, the 2019 ones. You will also see the C3 indicators, and you'll see the Common Core standards for both ELA and social studies. So we've aligned them to both of those. And at the very end is the citation. So if you want to see any of the resources that were used to create the lesson, they're all there and cited for you. So when you get to the supplemental materials document, the supplemental materials always have 4 parts to them. The first one is a graphic organizer, and we're going to come back to these in just a second, but there is a visual graphic organizer for every lesson that you can use with the kids. There is always a copy of the big ideas in the supplemental materials as well. So that would be if you want to print out a copy or share it digitally with students, the big ideas of the lesson. There are word cards included in every lesson plan, and they build sequentially over the course of the unit. So lesson 1 will start with word card 1 and build. And then when you move to the next unit, the numbers start over. So unit 2 will restart with word card number 1. And we'll come back to those in just a second as well. And then there's the student handout. So these are anything that the kids need in front of them. So however you do that, whether it's paper pencil or you do it digitally, those are the things the kids need to interact with. The slide decks all vary just a little bit based on the lesson. Some slide decks are much longer, some are much shorter. It just kind of depends what the lesson is tackling. But every slide deck has a unit compelling question. And that's so the kids, anytime we're asking the kids to come back and rethink about the unit compelling question, we have it to be able to be projected on your screen. They also always have the lesson question, because anytime we want the kids to respond to the lesson question, we want them to have a visual of it on the board. So those are built into every slide deck. And then everything else sort of varies by lesson. So you'll see images, you'll see text, graphs, any videos you have to show are embedded in the slide deck. So you can just press play. So again, they vary in length because of that. So within the whole course, and you'll see this in unit 1, but we wanted to kind of tell you about it at the very beginning of this series because you'll see it in every unit. There are scaffolds that are built in throughout the course to make the text and material accessible to 8th graders. So we know this is a challenge, right? They're grappling with really challenging, big, difficult topics that are complex. And we tried to make a very intentional effort to make sure that we've set up this curriculum to be accessible to all of the students. So some of the scaffolds you'll see, and we'll go into each of these in just a second individually. But again, there are word cards. So the word cards have that vocabulary that kids need to understand the unit and to understand the lesson. The word cards are built into every lesson as a vocabulary support. Text has been adapted, and we'll talk about all the different ways that's done, but we're not handing the kids a copy of the entire US Constitution and saying, okay, read that and let us know what you think. So all of the text that's challenging is adapted so that 8th graders should be able to approach it. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. We've also provided screencasts of read alouds for any text that we think is particularly challenging. There are some texts that even with adaptations are still very difficult. And so we've done a screencast of read alouds for those. The journaling, again, is built in throughout the course as a scaffold for students so that they can have time to process and reflect. And then there's a lot of collaborative learning activities and turn and talk. So the curriculum is written to be very collaborative. You'll have your kids in different groupings, turning and talking every day. So you're not going to see any lessons within the unit that are just an hour of direct instruction. So some of these scaffolds, to kind of zero you in on them here. The first one is the word cards. The word cards are going to highlight any vocabulary in a lesson that we think students need to know and that are important concepts moving forward. So each word card has the word, or it might be a concept like raw materials. It has an 8th grade friendly definition. And then it'll have the example sentence where we've used the word or the concept in a sentence that will help the students understand its use in this context. So the word cards, again, they build sequentially throughout a unit. So at this point, I pulled these from unit 1, and at this point in the lesson, they've had 31 vocab words, because at this point, we're multiple lessons into the unit. At the very beginning of the course, in the course abstract, and I'll show you where this is in a minute, but we also have it hyperlinked here, and I think Stacy is going to drop it in the chat for you right now. There is a document that talks about how to use the word cards throughout the course. The goal of the word cards is for students to be able to engage with this vocabulary in its authentic context. They are not intended to be used for vocab quizzes. So what we don't want is for us to hand the kids 50 vocab word cards and say, okay, memorize these by Friday because there's a quiz. Because we know that that doesn't help to build vocabulary and it doesn't help to build content knowledge. So this document has a lot of ideas about how you can use these word cards before a lesson, during a lesson, and after a lesson. And you likely have ideas of your own that you already do in your classroom. But this document talks about both vocabulary throughout the course as well as how to use the journals throughout the course, which we'll come back to in just a little bit. And Stacy, I don't know if you want to add anything about the word cards at all. Good, okay. So we talked a little bit about the text being adapted. The text throughout the course is adapted, and we adapted it based on whatever adaptation made the most sense for that piece of text. So I'm just going to give you a few examples that you're going to see in Unit 1. So when you encounter them, you recognize them. One way we've adapted the text is to add head notes. So if we're giving the students a piece of text, and oftentimes it's a primary source, that we think they need some context to really understand it, we've added in a head note that gives them that background knowledge and that context so that they can head into the text understanding when and why it was written. Another adaptation we've made is to build in vocabulary supports actually within the text. So these are going to be vocabulary supports that they're not word cards because they don't really need to know them to move forward in the course, and they don't really need to know them outside of this piece of text, but they do need to understand them to understand that piece of text. So many of you, I'm sure, will nod in agreement with me here, but if you've ever handed your kids the Mayflower Compact with no vocabulary support, you get a lot of like wide-eyed blank stares because there's a lot of difficult vocabulary in it. So in the Mayflower Compact, when the kids analyze it, we've actually just pulled some of the vocabulary they need to understand it and placed it right within the text. A third adaptation you're going to see, and you might not even always recognize it at first, except you'll see it says adapted from, is we've actually just rewritten difficult portions of text. So text that really vocab isn't going to, just giving them vocab isn't going to help, and a head note's not giving them quite enough. We've actually just rewritten portions of text to make it 8th grade accessible. And a fourth adaptation that you'll see throughout the course is excerpts. So we've taken long, complex documents and we've just excerpted the portions that students need to understand that lesson. So a really great example of this is the Magna Carta. We do not give the kids the entire Magna Carta in this curriculum. You can see that we have pulled out, it goes from like line 30 to 31 to 38. We've excerpted just the portions that kids need. And actually in this one, we also added a head note. And I know I mentioned this before, but we do have, if you look at the lesson sequence on Atlas, you'll notice that many of the units have screencasts at the bottom. Those are think alouds and read alouds for texts that are very challenging, or that really they need someone to read it aloud for them. You can use these screencasts just with your kids, so you can just hit play and use the screencast. You also can just use the screencast for you. If you just want a refresher on what you should be pulling out in that text with students, you can watch the screencast to build your own background knowledge, and then you can go and do the read aloud live with your kids. So you can use these multiple ways. And the other thing to think about is that you can also just create your own screencast if you think there's any other text that your kids will need support with that we did not include a screencast for. And again, journaling's another scaffold that you're going to see in every lesson. So in that same document that Stacy dropped in the chat, there is an explanation of how to use the journals throughout the course. So it talks about how to set up the journals. Again, the beginning of the year is a great time to build in some time for the kids to decorate their journals. That is not a waste of time. It gives them ownership of it. It gives them a chance to really make the journals their own. And it's also a really great time to build some classroom climate as well. As the kids start to decorate them and take ownership, you get to know the kids a little better. The one thing about the journals that is important is that they not be graded for accuracy. We're not collecting kids' journals at the end of the lesson and saying, okay, you get an A because you got it right. These need to be places that are safe for kids to practice and take risks and think and process throughout the course. In order for them to really serve their purpose. So, some teachers have said, well, I really do need to I need to assign some grade to it. You may consider, if you're looking to grade them, to just do like a completion grade. Did they make an attempt? Did they put some ideas down? Another idea that teachers have told me before is after, let's say, a week of journaling, you might ask the kids to note for you or to put a Post-it on one entry that they'd like for you to read and actually read and grade, or to read and to grade for some sort of some specific point you're looking for. And that's another way you could approach it. But what we don't want to do is make these feel threatening to students, that they don't want to take risks and they don't want to think through these arguments and take chances. So again, at the classroom level, this is up to you how you approach them, but we would highly recommend not grading them for content and accuracy. So at our next meeting, which is September 22nd, Christy Osborne, who is an ESL consultant at Oakland Schools, is going to be here to talk to you a little bit more about scaffolds within the course and specifically within the units. Christy has also created two really amazing documents that we're going to share with you right now, and Stacy will pop them in the chat for you. So she's really taken some time to go through this curriculum and to think about the supports that can be done in the classroom for multilingual learners. And Christy's argument too is that any supports that are good for multilingual learners are good for all of our students. So this is not just a document to think about for multilingual learners, it's really to support all of our kids. When you open these two documents, and here I will just open this essential practices one to show you, you can certainly start to take a look through these, but we will, again, Christy's going to come back to these documents and go through them in greater detail next month. So if you don't have a chance to dig into them too deeply, that's totally fine. What she's done is she's broken down the essential practice. So for instance, building background with kids, vocabulary support with kids. She's listed some strategies for multilingual learners, and then she's actually hyperlinked examples within the curriculum. Most of her examples in this document do come from Unit 1. So if you want to take a look ahead of starting the school year to get a feel for some of these supports, if you just click any of these hyperlinks, it will take you right into the curriculum and show you the exact place she's talking about where she would recommend a support be embedded. She also has these for translanguaging and home language support, which she'll talk about more in September, and also accommodated simplified text and visuals. So as you can see, we could probably spend 7 hours going just through this document, but we thought we'd at least put it in your hands today if you're ready and have time to start going through it. And Christy will come back to that in September. have to reshare. Stacy Woodward does not like it if I leave it off the share mode, so I have to make sure I do that. So another change as we start to look at the units more specifically is we've made some intentional changes to language throughout the curriculum. The language, of course, language has evolved since the curriculum was originally written and since the 8th grade course was originally written. And we've also made an attempt to align some of the language to align with the 2019 standards. So just to kind of give you a quick run through of some of the language you'll see in the new curriculum consistently throughout each unit. We have removed any terms that's unless they're in a primary source document, which there's teacher notes to talk about that with your kids. But within the lesson plans and the slide decks, you'll notice that we use Indigenous peoples and Indigenous nations, or we refer to the specific nation wherever possible. We have changed any time there was a reference in the former curriculum to slaves. We have changed it to enslaved people. There's also a note in there to talk to the kids about this. We need to bring them into this conversation, and we need to talk to them about, we use the term enslaved people because that was a status thrust upon them. That was not who they were. And having that conversation with kids is important. And again, they will see other terms used in primary source documents, and within the curriculum, there are teacher notes to make sure you talk to the kids about that before they encounter the primary source that might use an outdated term. We also have used the word enslavers throughout the curriculum. The next one is a shift that will probably need to also be addressed with students. So rather than using the term plantations, we have used the term slave labor camps. Students might know the word plantations from prior years. They might know it from 5th grade. So this is something that you want to be explicit about with kids at the beginning of the course, but you'll see that change has been made throughout the units. Whenever we refer to Black people, it is capitalized. White people is not capitalized. And this really doesn't come up until a little bit later into the course, but when we get to units that are looking at movement west, we have avoided the word settlers or pioneers whenever possible, because we do not want to indicate that that land was unsettled or open and uninhabited. So that's been a conscious change we made. We also, and again, this comes up a little bit later in the course more often, but we have removed the term runaway slaves and we now use freedom seekers instead. So again, these are some language changes that you'll see throughout the course, but it's something just once you know about them, talking to the kids about them so the kids know when they encounter the terms, why they're being used as well. Okay, so now that you've had to sit and listen to me for 42 minutes, we're going to get you doing some things. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is Stacy is going to drop into the chat a link to the course description. And this is on Atlas, so you can return to it anytime, but we popped it into a document for you. So what we want you to do is we want you to read the course description. And we want you to think about what is something that's familiar to you in the course description. What might be something that's new, and what's one question you have? And as you're reading and as you're thinking about these things, if you can just drop your thoughts into the chat. So we're going to give you about 6 minutes to do that. And we'll just keep the chat active as you read. We'll take about 2 more minutes. So even if you're not quite done, that's fine. If you can just drop one thought in the chat, and thanks, Michelle, I saw you got us started. You don't have to answer all 3, but if you can answer one of the 3 in the chat. Great, thank you. I'm loving all of these ideas. A lot of these questions we're going to address as we keep moving forward, but we will definitely answer any we don't at the end, because these are wonderful, and a lot of these I'm excited to talk about. All right, so we're going to have you shift now and actually take a look at the whole course. So what you're looking at right now is the pacing guide for the course, which you'll find in Atlas. The little red bars show us how many weeks on that unit, but to make it easier, we just have the weeks listed as well in the course description, just in case you couldn't tell exactly how many weeks that is. So what we want you to do is a protocol called Interview the Image. So go ahead and take a look at the pacing guide, and all you're going to do is ask questions. So any questions that come to mind, I want you to just drop them in the chat. So if you're a journalist and you have to ask this image questions, what would those questions be? And by the way, this is a really fun strategy to do with any image in your class for the kids: cartoons, photos, sketches. It's a really great one. All right, any other questions you have, go ahead and pop them in the chat. And Kim, that's a great question. So one reason unit 10 is so short is that there's no new content. Unit 10 is really a reflective unit where they look back, they're not learning any new content or concepts. It's just a synthesis unit, which is why it's only 5 days.
And if I recall, isn't that really connected to one particular standard at the end?
It is. Yep, there's one standard at the end of the course that previews what they'll be doing in US history in high school. And it asks them really to just go back and sort of synthesize what they learned in the course. So that's actually a really fun unit because they get to just kind of big picture reflect on the year and come up with a final argument. So any other questions that jump out in this pacing? Because the pacing is a little bit different than perhaps how you've paced in prior years. Another good one, Kim. The answer is no. That one will address the presidents from the very founding until, like, obviously Washington moving into the early 1800s. So yeah, chronologically it'll address those presidents, but there's quite a few in there, so it's enough for them to grapple with. Not through the Civil War. Michelle, can you unmute and tell me a little bit more about that question?
I'm sorry, I thought you had said through the early 1800s, and I didn't know if we should cover the presidents up through the late 1800s.
Oh, great question. Yeah, Kim's question was about Unit 3 specifically. So in this one, they're just looking at the presidents through there. Yeah, but they will, of course, go through Reconstruction. One thing you may have noticed that is certainly different from when I taught 8th grade, it's just that we've allotted 6 weeks to teach Reconstruction at the end of the course, which is likely longer than you've spent on it in the past. Jeremy's going to talk a little bit more about this in a bit, but we have made a very intentional effort to carve out a full 6 weeks to address Reconstruction. In many ways, the course is leading up to this unit where kids really get to take a look at what happened in the Reconstruction era and think about how it is the effect of what happened before, as well as the legacy of Reconstruction. It's a pivotal era for kids to understand moving into high school US history, as well as to understand what's going on in the world today, in the country today. So that is a shift that you may notice. Another question we've had periodically is, oh my gosh, only 2 weeks on Civil War. Civil War, actually, though, the preceding unit 7 is looking at all of the events leading up to the war and the outbreak of war. And then the Civil War itself is 2 weeks. So really, we're looking at a 5-week unit on the Civil War era. So we're certainly not shortchanging the Civil War. But when you look at the standards for the actual war itself, they're actually easily addressed in 2 weeks. Okay, so where are we and where are we headed this year? So basically this series, which is going to have 11 parts, we are going to meet monthly, and each month we're going to address the unit that's coming up. So today we're about to dive into Unit 1. In September, we'll take a look at Unit 2 and so on. You will notice right here, when we get to late March, early April, we are going to be running a full day Reconstruction workshop. So leaving 6 weeks for Reconstruction is a big shift. And we want to make sure that we're really prepared to do that. So that will be a full day workshop, date to be announced. We're still sort of hammering out the details right now, but we'll let you know as soon as we know. And then we'll also have another meeting while you're in the middle of teaching Reconstruction to check in and see how it's going and see what other support we can offer. And then our last session will be in May as you head into teaching Unit 10. And then you don't have to see me in June or July. So there you go. That's good. Okay, so Unit 1 preview. Let's dive in. So Unit 1 is 3 to 4 weeks long, and it's really up to you whether you spend 3 or 4. It probably just depends on what you think your kids need in terms of support and what they're coming to you with. What we're going to have you do right now to get us going Stacy is going to drop this in the chat. We're going to give you the Unit 1 abstract. So just take a look at what Unit 1 is all about, what the kids are doing. And we want you to think about what seems new, the same 3 questions. What's familiar and what questions do you have? So we're going to give you 5 minutes to read. And then at that point, we're just going to unmute and ask a couple of you to share. So you'd have 5 minutes just to skim through that abstract. Thanks, Dawn. Yeah, we definitely have that on our radar. So we will make sure we do our best to avoid all of those testing windows. All right, so wherever you are, and if you didn't finish, that's fine. What are you noticing? What's looking new? What's running through your mind? What seems familiar to how you normally start your year with this course? Gotta love the found breakup letter. It's a gem. It works every time. Is there anything else you're noticing or wondering? Yeah, Kim, thanks for bringing that up. There is a big focus in Unit 1 on reviewing and introducing historical skills. So we're thinking about how do we read, think, and write the way historians read, think, and write. And those are skills that they're going to use throughout the course. So it's kind of fun. We get to introduce them in Unit 1 and get them familiar with them. Yeah, thank you, Drew. More detailed explanation of the rationale for what to teach and focus on, definitely. John thinks the hope is that it's intentional. It's Unit 1, right? We have a big challenge in Unit 1, as we all know, as 8th grade teachers. You have to kind of like review some stuff we hope they learn in 5th grade, but also teach them some of these historical thinking skills and also get them ready to dive into Unit 2, which is really where the meat of the 8th grade course happens. And we've got to do all that in 3 to 4 weeks. So this is a kind of pared down, very intentional way to approach that and accomplish all 3 of those. We're definitely not going to be able to review everything they should have learned in 5th grade, but we're going to hit the stuff we think they need to move forward.
Which I think is addressing Kathleen's question.
Yeah, Kathleen, excellent question.
And I think this year in particular, you will find this to be true as an 8th grade teacher for this course. The kids that are coming into 8th grade now were 5th graders in 2020. And they would have been learning about colonial America, like as the pandemic hit. So you can imagine, you can just plan for that. They probably this year more than other years probably are lacking that foundational knowledge, but what we've put in there is like, here's what we think they need to know. Good enough.
And Kathleen, to address that a little further. So when you get, and we'll show you this in a second, but when you get to lesson 3, starting at lesson 3 in Unit 1, the kids really do kind of a deep and focused review of what they need to know from the colonial region. So even if they don't remember anything from the colonial regions, we're going to kind of go over what you have to know about the New England, Middle, and Southern colonies in order to move forward in the course. And that's an excellent question because it's of course an issue every year. So one thing we just want to throw out to you, and we're about to look at the lesson level of Unit 1. Every unit has a unit graphic organizer too. So these are certainly, they're helpful for you, but you can also use these with your kids. So I'm actually going to let Stacy, she has some amazing ideas about how to use these with kids. So I'm going to let her unmute and just talk a little bit about some ideas.
Hey, so over the years, actually, teachers have shared really great ways that they've used and thought about using these kind of graphic organizers. So if you want to think about ahead of time, using it before you start a unit, I can see putting this up and having kids, you can do like a chalk talk with it. What's new? What's familiar? What questions do you have? Or connect to what they already know? I can see doing that. I could see leaving it up during the unit as a sort of anchor chart to ideas as you're going along and sort of helping kids situate the learning they're doing that particular day to the bigger ideas in the unit. I can also see at the end using it as a sort of assessment piece, what would kids add to it or pull things off and see if they could rearrange it. I could see cutting it up and having them rearranging the graphic organizers. So I think that there's a lot of ways that you could use this. It's not just a teacher document. It's also put it in front of kids. It's not a secret,
Yeah, Michelle, that's a great idea. Be kind of cool as you build throughout the course to see them all as quick refreshers. Yeah, I love that. Okay, so let's get into we're going to get into the details now. Navigating Atlas. So, and I know a few of you are brand new to MC3, which is great. We're so happy you're here. Stacy's going to drop in for you the landing page for the Oakland Schools public Atlas site. We're going to use that to show you how to navigate today. It will look like this when you get to it. Just one thing to keep in mind. So Oakland Schools, which houses the MC3 curriculum, this is the public site, but you also at the district level, Oakland Schools pushes curriculum to the districts twice a year. So at this point, all of your districts have received the full 8th grade course because it's completely done and has been pushed. But we're going to navigate through the public site today. So when you search, if you go to grade and drop to grade 8, and if you drop to social studies and you browse, you're actually going to have two courses come up. We tried to make it really explicit. This is the old one in giant capital letters, and this is the updated one. So updated 2022, use this. That's the one you should use. We're leaving the old one up just for this year as people are transitioning and moving to the new course. But you want to click into the new one. And when you click into it, you get to the course landing page, which has the course description that you just skimmed through. And if you scroll to the bottom, you'll see the pacing guide that we just looked at. And then once you're on the pacing guide, to get into the unit, you just click the hyperlink and it will take you into that unit's landing page. So when you're in unit 1, you'll see the compelling question for the unit. You'll see that same graphic organizer we just looked at. You'll see the unit abstract, which you just skimmed through. And then down here, there's a lot going on down here. So the next thing is going to be the content expectations. There's a lot of them because, again, we align them to a lot of different standards and indicators. If you don't want to have to scroll forever, you can just use this little arrow and collapse it, and then that'll take you to everything else. Otherwise, you're welcome to scroll as well. The essential focus questions will show you the lesson level questions. So you'll see the unit compelling question and then the lesson level questions. But probably what you're most interested in is at the very bottom. So if you scroll to the bottom, you'll have the lesson sequence. Each of these is hyperlinked. So when you click it, it will take you to the Google Doc, and we've purposely set it up to have you create a template. So you'll have to go to the upper right corner and click create template. And that's just so it makes a copy onto your own Google Drive. It's just much easier, and that way you are housing a copy of it. So you'll see the lesson plan, the supplementals, and the slide deck for each lesson. And again, if there's any screencast, you'll see it says like lesson 2 screencast below. You just go to the bottom and you'll find the video for the screencast. On the right side, you're going to see the key concepts addressed in the unit, the intellectual processes, and all of the resources for the whole unit. Again, these are listed in each lesson plan. This is just like a massive compilation. So it seems very long for that reason. To navigate back, if you're new to Atlas, you can either use the back button or you can just click, they have a little path at the top. If you just click the course name, it'll take you back to that course landing page, which might be the easiest way to navigate. Okay, so this is the Unit 1 layout. So this is the first 3 to 4 weeks. And again, Kathleen's question was a great one. How do you do all this in 3 to 4 weeks? This is how we think you can do it, where the kids will have what they need to move forward into Unit 2. Our intention in Unit 1 was to do 3 things. Number 1, which Kim noted, is to review and reteach and perhaps introduce them to these historical reading, writing, and thinking skills. How do we read like a historian? How do we think like a historian? How do we write like a historian? The second thing was to review the key 5th grade content that they need about the colonies moving forward. So we've really zeroed in on the things that they need to know foundationally about the colonies, about the philosophical foundations of government, about European and indigenous influences on government, and then the declaration. And you'll see the end of the unit is very heavy on the declaration. We really want to build the kids' understanding of the declaration as a historical document and as a contemporary document. So the end of the unit, the kids have a chance to really have this deeper understanding of the declaration. And especially even if they got to it in 5th grade, they probably didn't have a ton of time to go into it. Okay, I'm going to let Stacy explain this task while I get the breakout rooms ready.
Okay, so you are going to go into breakout rooms. I think it'll be of about 3 to 4 people.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And what you're going to do is you're going to, quickly introduce yourselves. If you click the link that I just put in the chat, you will see that you are going to be assigned 2 lesson abstracts, depending on which room number you're in. So you only have to read 2 out of all of them. And then you're going to, take a minute to read them and then discuss the abstracts and then fill out that graphic organizer. So Molly, if you wouldn't mind clicking on the organizer so I can just give an example. So for instance, if you are in breakout room 1, that means you're going to focus on the abstracts for lessons 1 and 2. The way you get to the abstracts is by clicking the link at the top. We've just compiled them all into one document. So you don't have to go into Atlas and find the lessons. They're all right there for you. So just read the abstracts for those 2. Then you will go back to your graphic organizer. You'll talk about them. And then you're just going to put some gists in there, right? So what is the lesson mostly about? Basically, what are students doing? What kind of activities are they doing during the lesson? I know right away you'll go to the challenges because that's how we all think, like, oh man, what am I gonna have to problem solve for my kids? A lot of you probably haven't met your kids yet. So maybe you won't know all the answers, but you can imagine years past. And then connected to that, or what are some of the adaptations that you might need to implement to address those challenges? So what we're going to do, are the breakout rooms ready? Ms.
They are
Miller?
ready. And I would say just pay attention to your breakout room number as it sends you into it, because that will tell you which abstracts you're doing.
So the big idea is you're just going to read 2 out of all of them. Later on, you can read all of them if you want, but you're just going to focus on 2 and discuss them. Okay, we have about 10 minutes. Is that right, Natalie?
Yep, that's about right.
Okay, great. Well, we will see you back here in 10 minutes.
All right. Oh, in German. Okay. I left you guys unassigned. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks. Everything's looking more amazing. So really,
Thanks,
really
Jeremy.
impressed.
We're glad you were able to join for, and thank you for joining the beginning. So you.
No, me too. You know, I was able, like I said, I was able to go through everything and sort of
Yeah.
cursory ways, look a little deeper in some spots, but to see this overview and to see the reaction of the teachers and yeah, no, it's really great.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Well, I'm gonna 10 minutes. I'll just keep the time, and then in 10, I
You-
will.
Want to pause the recording?
Let me see. Yes, if it's gonna let me. I'm the recording. So we're a little short on time. So instead of sending you into breakout rooms again, we're just going to kind of walk you through what this activity is. We were going to give you a feel for some of the activities kids are doing in Unit 1 that they'll continue to do in the rest of the course. I am going to drop this link in the chat just so you can take a look at it while I share it. So and actually, Dawn, I'm so glad shared out because this was the activity she was talking about. So in lesson 2 of the unit, the lesson focuses on the Boston Massacre. So it is a review of the Boston Massacre in terms of content, but it's actually also introducing kids to the historical reading skills that we're going to be engaging with throughout the course. So when you take a look at the historical reading skills chart, students are going to be looking at 4 key skills that we focus on throughout the course. One is sourcing. And someone earlier made a great point about this. I think it was Dawn actually, how do we teach kids how to source and to know what sources are reliable? We also have kids contextualizing. Then we have kids doing close reading. And finally, we have kids corroborating. So looking across sources to corroborate. What do sources share? What do they not share? So these are the 4 skills that come up repetitively throughout the course. And we're really trying to teach kids how to think, read, and write the way historians think, read, and write. So we're asking them to come into the discipline with us and to do this work with us, rather than us just telling them this is a reliable source, or I already corroborated for you, and here's what the sources said. We're asking the kids to do that work with us. In this specific activity in lesson 2, what the kids are actually doing, and this is not just happening really quickly in one day, this is a multi-day lesson. The kids are actually looking at 3 different sources about the Boston Massacre. So the first source likely looks familiar to you if you've taught 8th grade before. This is the account of Captain Thomas Preston, who was a British soldier, and he is telling his view of what occurred at the massacre. And in this text, you can see we have some vocabulary supports built in. The second source the kids read is the account that probably also looks familiar, which is the anonymous source written by a colonist. And you can see the opening line to it is the horrid massacre in Boston perpetrated in the evening of the 5th day of March by soldiers of the 29th Regiment. So we get the colonial perspective. And then the third source is actually a chromolithograph that was illustrated by John Buford in 1856. So quite a bit after the massacre took place. So in this lesson, the kids are actually taking a look at these sources. They're doing close reading and they're annotating, and you actually model the first one for them. There is a screencast for this. So if you don't feel comfortable annotating it in front of the kids, if this is the first time you've taught it, you can use the screencast. And then the kids are working collaboratively to take a look at the other two. And when they're done, what the kids have a chance to do is to do some corroboration, what actual historians do. They're going to look at these sources and say, well, in what ways are they telling the same story? What is consistent throughout all three of these accounts? Then they say, but what are some things that are different in each of these accounts? And last but not least, we ask them to think about which source is most reliable and why it's most reliable, which is a really great conversation to have. I've had this discussion with kids and it's fascinating. The conversation is really rich. So we're asking them to come in and do this work with us. This activity, the other neat thing about it is kids are really having a chance to do some deep dives on primary sources. They're having a chance to interact with the text, and they're having a chance to have some really great dialogue. And the kids get very passionate about this. What actually happened? A fun extension to this is possibly if you have a textbook, pull out your textbook and see how it describes the Boston Massacre. And then how does that relate to the sources we've read here? Stacey, I don't know if you want to mention anything else about disciplinary literacy before we move forward.
I would just say that this is one of the, I think, major shifts happening right now in social studies education, and it's a welcome change, I would say. In fact, there are lots of grownups that I wish we could all just go around and teach them how to do these sorts of skills. They help kids, not just if they want to be historians someday, which most of them will not be, but in life, right? So navigating, their civic life, their work life, their digital lives. These are important skills. And I don't feel like I need to even make the case too hard here. You guys probably are seeing that for yourselves. So.
The other nice thing about this lesson, so they're doing this really early in the course. This is lesson 2 of unit 1, but we asked them to come back to this chart over and over and over and over throughout the course. So hopefully they're affixing this chart right into their We the People journals. And this is something they come back to and hone. We're not expecting them to be experts at close reading or sourcing or contextualizing or corroborating in lesson 2. But this is something that by the end of the year, the kids have done it over and over, and they're really starting to internalize the process. So later in the course, we don't always ask them to pull the chart out. We just ask them to do the skill. So this is just kind of a snapshot of some of the things they're doing in this first unit that I think will be a lot of fun to teach. So, all right, we are going to turn it over now to Jeremy. So Jeremy Nessoff is here. We're really excited. He is the Director of District Partnerships at Facing History and Ourselves. If you have not interacted with Facing History and Ourselves before, you are in for a treat because it is just a really wonderful organization. And I think you're going to love what he has to share. So I am going to unshare my screen and let Jeremy share his and take it away.
Thank you, Molly. Can you hear me okay?
Here, let me unshare.
Great.
There you go. You should be all set.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I already had a chance to say this to Stacy and Molly in the break, but I'm really happy to be here today. Stacy and Molly and Chris and some of your other colleagues in Michigan and I have been talking for a couple of years about how Facing History can support your work in different ways, and to see in a lot of ways the culmination of those conversations in this 8th grade revised course And not to take any credit beyond being a resource that Molly and Stacy have incorporated, and Chris, and I'm sure others that worked on this, into what appears to me to be an incredibly comprehensive revision and resource. I had some time to dig into the materials, as I mentioned to Molly and Stacy, myself, but to sit here and hear it presented and gone over is even, I feel like everything's just more impressive than when I first looked at it. To see the embedded scaffolding, the range of resources, and quite honestly, the bravery to take some really principled stands that I think are clearly supported in scholarship and in facts, and by the consensus of scholars today, but yet are not clearly understood or supported across our country, across our social, political landscapes. So, I'm just happy to have had any contribution to this, and for Facing History to do anything we can to support the work. So with that said, and I'm gonna see if I can share my screen on the first try for once, instead of like going through 5 different times, like even 2 years into COVID, I'm still doing. Well, I got it right, but of course I'm not on the right slide, but can you see the slideshow now? So I'm gonna fast zoom backwards. So over the next hour,
Jeremy,
really
sorry to interrupt. We
Oh,
actually can't. It's just a blank
Oh, you
screen
can't.
that says you started
Gotcha.
screen sharing. Yeah.
So wow, I spoke too soon, huh? Not only did I share the wrong thing, but the wrong slide, but the wrong thing. Let's try this one more time. How about screen sharing is paused, which is something I've never seen before, to be honest. Here we go.
Jeremy,
Resume
do you
share.
want me
Oh,
to
I think-
share your slide deck for you? Is that?
No, I think I got it. I
Got
think
it?
it
Okay.
might have been, yeah. Or I think I can. I'm clicking on resume share and it's not working. So let me try one thing. Is there anything that you think, because actually that's something that I haven't seen before. Is it maybe anything that you can unpause sharing on your end, Molly?
I'm fully unpaused on my share,
Okay.
so
Let me
Try
try that
again.
again.
Click
This
somewhere.
is, I think I jinxed us by saying something about 2 years into this
but
way of working, because it still says resume share and it's not working when I click on it, which has never happened to me before.
hang on, let me
Sorry,
just.
with some,
No, you're okay. Yep,
Yeah.
you should be all set. But if worst comes to worst, I can just share your deck for you and
Yeah.
tell me when to advance.
I think that might be what needs to
Okay.
happen, because I'm doing
Sure.
it again and yeah, it's
All right.
not resuming when I click on it, so I
Let me try
apologize
to
about that.
share. Let's hopefully mine will.
Okay,
Are you seeing my screen?
I am. Yeah.
Okay, great. Just
Thank
let
you.
me know when you want me to advance and I'll click.
All right. Thank you, Molly,
Yep.
and I appreciate
Oh, no
that.
problem.
Apologies, everybody, and if you could advance. So what we'll try to do today is on the next slide is the agenda. And we'll take a look at some materials from our back to school toolkit, which seems very appropriate as we all get ready to go back to school. But it's also appropriate because it really explains what's at the heart and foundation of Facing History's approach. And that's an effective, safe, and brave classroom environment where students, yes, feel safe, but that they're also entering conversations that are difficult in ways that are effective and safe, but also takes a level of trust and bravery. So we'll take a look at some very specific things from that, including talking about our why for teaching this year and ideas for addressing issues of identity and community. And then we'll take a look at the Reconstruction era, both broadly about this question about why study Reconstruction and one example of a resource specifically from it. So next slide, please.
Sorry, Jeremy. Yeah, before I advance, I just wanted to note
Please.
too, when you get to Unit 9, which is Reconstruction, it actually is Facing History and Ourselves unit on Reconstruction. So when you get to that unit, the setup will look a little bit different than the lesson plans you've been using throughout the year, and that's all explained within the unit. But Facing History and Ourselves has crafted a wonderful unit about Reconstruction, which we have actually just embedded in the curriculum.
And I'll just
Great.
add one more thing.
Please.
Last year, Molly and I attended Facing History's summer sort of seminar on Reconstruction, and we were blown away. If you have a chance to do any of the stuff that they're doing, you should do it. And when it came time for us to write the Reconstruction unit, we both just agreed, like, we're not going to write anything better than what Facing History did. It's unbelievable what they've done. So that's what happened. So we ended up working out this great partnership where we're using like the most comprehensive unit on Reconstruction I've ever seen. So that's its origin story.
And and I really appreciate that. And and yes, thank you for the kind words. But it's also for me just about it's showing how Facing History can be effective. For us, one of the greatest pitfalls, because we were an organization founded by teachers and for teachers. I'm a former 7th through 12th grade humanities teacher and administrator in New York and New York City and Vermont, so two slightly different places. And we know that one of the biggest pitfalls is starting from scratch and the pressure of being the most brilliant person ever and doing things. So for us, the fact that the unit has been taken and is aligned with your approach and is able to be plugged in, we also know that still you're going to take it and make it your own. You're going to adapt, you're going to scaffold, you're going to change because you know your context the best. We certainly don't. And we hope to learn it as best as we can. But, obviously you're the experts on your classroom community and what needs to work there for you. So that's one thing we also always hope to hear about, like how have you adapted? How have you changed? How have you scaffolded differently for success? So thank you. The next slide, Molly, you have to click through a few times to get everything to appear. One of those times that I added animation for, I'm not sure why. But for the back to school toolkit, one of the things that's really valuable in there is this idea of establishing opening routines. And I'm going to give you some time, 3 different times actually during this hour. We're going to go off and have some time to read and look at things ourselves. So in a little bit, you'll have some time to explore the back to school toolkit on your own. But one of the things that is in there and many different ideas for it are these routines. And the goal is to set an inclusive and welcoming tone, to create a community that I mentioned before that's safe, brave, reflective, and nurturing, and get ready for engaging work and conversations. So just one example, we're not going to do this now, but if you go to the next slide, Molly, is this idea of a mood meter. And if you click through to the next slide, you'll see the same thing, but with some links for how we use it for Mentimeter. So Mentimeter is a great online tool where with smartphones, and you don't have to do this now, but you could click the QR code or you could click a link and then you go and you put in, actually Molly, sorry, if you could go back one just so they can see the color code. So then people would respond, where is my emotion now? And then you would see a chart come up. And even for students, it could be a very cool way just at the beginning of a week or something, just to see where people are at and see what the overall snapshot of the mood in your room is. So there's a lot of different ideas for routines like this in the back to school toolkit. And if you could go ahead 2 slides, Molly. So just for those of you who are new to Facing History, I don't want to do a lot of time and overview or explaining us, but I do want to just give a few quick looks at some important things like our mission statement, which is to use the lessons of history to challenge teachers and their students to stand up to bigotry and hate. So obviously, I hope if that's the first time you're reading that, 1, I hope you like it, but then 2, I'm sure you're like, that's a pretty big mission. I have a lot of questions about that. How do you do that? What does this look like in a classroom? What resources do you have? How could I, try to act on this mission? So next slide, please. I think one thing that's really important at this time, possibly more than ever, but certainly always, is that for us, what happens in our schools, primarily our public schools, I would say, but certainly in schools of any kind, is hopefully reminding ourselves of the higher purpose of our work. None of us on this screen that I know yet have become fabulously wealthy from our chosen profession. I had the pleasure to be in a panel with the Teacher of the Year, Kurt Russell, the National Teacher of the Year. So maybe he's got a little celebrity and fame, but also not fabulously wealthy from his job. I think this is why we are here. We are here for a higher purpose than just getting our kids to pass a test or get good grades or get a job or graduate. All of that is important, yes. but we also always need to slow down and remind ourselves of the higher purpose, which for us is this idea of choosing to participate and an engaged citizenry. How can we help our students make choices that build and strengthen democracy, that build and strengthen their communities and their families? And so one thing I think we always need to remember is that we are a part of this process. We are a key. You are a key. Educators, teachers, students in schools are a key process to this idea of democracy is always becoming. It's never achieved. It's never, okay, that's it, let's move on from creating democracy. And that it can be easily lost, and that there is an internal struggle about that, and that we need to help create folks, citizens who are going to do things to strengthen it and not things to weaken it. So next slide, please. So just a little bit about how we do it, and then we'll get into some specific things. These are the 3 levels we really work on: is professional development, curriculum resources, and providing professional development and coaching support. The next slide, please. And these, our publications really run a large range spectrum that I urge you to take some time to look on our website. I won't go into too much here, but obviously what we've gathered here today to talk about is the Reconstruction era, is the image on the left. The organization started with a case study method, and so all of our units follow the same case study, which I'll talk about in a second. And the first one was on the Holocaust and human behavior. We also have study guides for specific pieces of literature, like you see here, Night and To Kill a Mockingbird, and then more sort of pedagogical approaches, for lack of a better term. So my part of the story is a unit that looks at identity and belonging that could start any social studies or ELA classroom. We also have a lot on teaching current events, fostering civic dialogue, etc. Next slide, Molly. And thank you, Molly. I'm sorry to have to keep asking that this happened. So as I mentioned, we're here to talk about the Reconstruction era and the fragility of democracy. And just to look a little bit more about how we do that, the next slide. Just quickly on this slide and the next one, just a couple of images that I think help communicate our work. So on the left is this idea of the pedagogical triangle. It's really a reflective tool that I see evidence of, that I could analyze and see evidence in the units that we are here today, in the course that has been created for you, that intellectual rigor is important and perhaps supremely important, but without engaging our students in authentic, engaging, and relevant ways, without things that involve them emotionally, that involve them in discussions and some of the most important moral and ethical dilemmas we face as human beings, it's not going to stick. We just know that. We know the facts, the dates, the figures are hugely important, and we know that people forget them after a certain amount of time. But if they are engaged with stories, with these powerful primary sources, like one we'll look at later, that tell these incredible stories of history that you couldn't even make up if you tried, then we believe they can remember the context and the dates and the figures, and have, talk about critical analysis of those events and what it teaches us about our lives today. On the right, the scope and sequence is the framework, the historical case study method. And again, I won't go too into this to say, except to say, it shows how we enter and come out of these difficult moments in history. So if we're looking at the Holocaust and genocide, if we're looking at the collective violence and terrorism, racial terrorism that happened during the Reconstruction era, we have to think about how we enter it. We can't just say, let's talk about lynching today. We can't just say, let's talk about Auschwitz today. And we can't just leave our students there. We can't just have them come in and say, thanks, Mr. Miss, the world's way worse than I ever imagined, and I'm just going to go crawl into a disempowered cave somewhere. So we want to come out. We want to talk about the legacies. We want to talk about how justice was attempted after these events. We want to move to this idea of choosing to participate. And the next slide. And, I hesitate again with too many images and EduSpeak, but I think this is all really important and things we can get into more. Just to say in this image that for Facing History, we are an academic program in social studies and English language arts, and we integrate these domains, the domains of civics, equity, and social emotional learning. So for us, it's not a pullout or something that only happens in advisory or in a civics education class or a whole school assembly. We integrate these into our programs because we believe that's how we can have the most success touching on those corners of the triangle. And thank you for the comments in the chat box. I'll try to take a look real quickly at some of them. Yeah, safe in, safe out, as Scott was saying. So, I really appreciate that. I'm leaving with hope. And, that's, and not that you were saying this, Scott, I think we're saying the same thing. It's not to throw, feel good bones or, lighten the mood moments to people to make them feel better. We look at rescue and resistance in the Holocaust, even though it may have been a very minuscule and to some people, not significant amount of people who were saved compared to the victims. But if all we're teaching is about death, and then what are we doing to our students? What are we doing for our students? So how can we teach this history in accurate and real ways that is not just about that? When it comes to Reconstruction, one of the ways we do that is by centering the Black experience, the African-American experience, because their struggle, the formerly enslaved people, and another part of the unit revision that I loved was the language choices you made, which is, again, represents current scholarship, represents the leadership of the National Park Service, who are using the same vocabulary. To formerly enslaved people, their activism, their agency, their resistance, their roots of understanding of freedom and slavery before the Civil War that set the agenda for the modern civil rights movement, all of those things are all of our history. They're our history, US history. And looking at those moments of upstanders, of people who stood up in some of the most difficult moments for justice, for freedom, for equality, for self-determination, is something that holds lessons for us today at a time when we need people to stand up as well. Next slide, please, Molly. We have information about why it's effective on our website. You can look at it anytime, but we'll just go on to the next one. Just so you know, the studies have been done, and the evidence is there if anyone would like to see it. So our resource on the Back to School Toolkit, as I mentioned, it starts with this idea of getting ready by looking at yourself. So it is looking at teachers too. It's not just about students. It's about us slowing down and thinking about our identity in relation to our students, our why, what we need to slow down and think. It has open and closing routines and different activities for remote or hybrid start, which, I'm not sure if any of you will be in that. I do think there are times, even if for schools that are fully back in person, you may have a kid who has COVID and is out for 2 weeks or something, and you may have students who are still engaging in hybrid ways that you may have activities for. So next slide, please. Oh yeah, so one of the things I mentioned that we always want to think about is our why and the higher purpose of this. And, we could talk about that just answering our question, what is our why? Why are we here? Or some of the questions on the next slide. And this is straight from the resource, and this idea again of starting with yourself. What challenges did I face last year in term? What surprised me? What fears do I have going into the new term? What hopes do I have? So again, we ask journaling to be a big part of our students' experience. We also think it's important for our teachers. I was the world's worst journaler in college. I even probably once had a few different pens because I had to fake a few weeks where I had to, submit a journal in different colors and such. Which there's, Annika, you're laughing. So I think we have to demonstrate for them, and one way to do that is to practice ourselves and model it. So next slide, please. So I'm going to ask you to take about 10 minutes, a little bit less. Let's check in after 5 minutes and see if people need some more time to follow this link, which I may be able to put in the chat box as easily as you, Molly, because I have it here. And Clint Smith is a writer who wrote the book, the image that you see there, on how the word is passed. And he is sort of a travel log where he went around the country to important sites such as Monticello and looked at how our history is told and why and by who. So in this, the link I just put in the chat, and yes, I do love him, and he is a great Twitter follower. He's also has a project of sort of like Khan Academy, but I think much better, about Black American history videos, and different topics are really good. So I'm going to ask you to take 5 minutes to read this. Again, why we're looking at this now is because it takes us deeply into some of those questions of knowing our why, of thinking about what it means to do our important job at this time. So let's take 5 minutes and then we'll come back and discuss. And if anyone has any questions or comments, feel free to unmute now or anytime. And I'll just set my timer for 5 minutes now. We'll come back together in about 2 minutes, if that's okay. 2 minutes. And 1 more minute, we'll come back together. Okay, so if we could come back together and just open the floor for the questions that are there. It'd be great to hear from at least one or two people, either question to respond to. What passages from the text resonated with you, and how did the text connect with or challenge your thinking about your why for this coming school year? So whoever would like to respond to either question, please do.
I like to share my first impression about just seeing this list of terrible things that happened and learning that kids, we want to protect them, so we feel afraid to broach those topics often, but they want to talk about them and ask about them and even say that it's horrible, and just all those reactions. They have to have those reactions, and they can't unless we can do that in a well-structured format. So it really got me thinking about that.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Really appreciate that. Thank you, Michelle. Anybody else?
Hi, it's Dawn from Southfield. I just want to
Hi,
say
Dawn.
your choice of sharing this is so timely and just gave me life, because so many times it's hard when you're presenting U.S. history to students that don't really connect with it the same way, to have this as a point, as an entry point into, well, you know, things get repeated when we don't deal with it. And we have to find a more constructive way of being a more inclusive society, and really reevaluating what we will stand for and what we won't.
Thank you very much, Don. I'm trying to find the exact line, but of slavery, he says, quote, "It was not an accident, it was not an act of God, it was not done by well-meaning people. It was not done by well-meaning people muddling into something which they didn't understand. It was a deliberate policy hammered into place in order to make money from Black flesh." And now in 1963, and I would argue we could insert 2022 right in there just as accurately, because we have never faced this fact, we are in intolerable trouble. And even, you know, the simple language there, because we have never faced this fact, the deep implications of that, of what that means, of how we could face that fact, of how we haven't faced that fact, of the implications of not facing that fact, are, I think, something we're still very much living with. So thank you very much, Don. Okay, next slide, please, Molly. And I really appreciate the comments and look forward to more. Oh, sorry, we were gonna break out into small groups, but I figured with this number is good just as it is. You can go to the next slide. So again, this is the same slide you need to click through a few times. You know, again, just as an example, those opening routines, this slowing down and reflecting on our purpose with readings, such as the one we just did, with some others, are all part of this back to school toolkit. And next slide, please. And so I'd like to give you now is a few minutes to look at the kit. And I can put the links in the chat box. There's two different ways that you can do that. One is by going to the Facing History website directly, and to where we have the information, and I'll put that link in there in 1 second, which is here. Ooh, get the right thing here. So this is the link to the Facing History website. And if you go to the next slide, Molly, we have a partnership with a group called Pear Deck, which is, you know, basically a form of slideshows that's easily accessible and usable for teachers. And so we have the back to school toolkit in the Pear Deck form as well. So I'd like to give you just about 5 minutes again on your own to just choose one, either the Facing History website or the Pear Deck. Go just surf around, click on whatever interests you. And then when you come back, if you go to the next slide, Molly, we'll talk about these questions. Very similar to the last ones, but again, what resonated with you? And it'd be great to hear if there's a strategy that spoke to you and you're like, aha, I'm going to use this on one day and 1 week, 2 weeks, whatever. Some examples of strategies that you think you'll actually use would be great. So let's take another 5 minutes to go do that, either on the Facing History website or on the Pear Deck. And I'll start my timer again. And just about a minute and a half till we come back together. Okay, just a few more seconds, we'll come back together. And when we do and we're ready, it'd be great if we could hear from two people who haven't spoken yet, at least for this session. What resonated with you, or what is one strategy we'll try and why? So any folks who haven't had a chance to speak yet, who would like to jump in, please do.
Hi, so I clicked on, oops.
Go ahead,
Oh,
Ken.
how about, I think, Kim, why don't you go ahead, and then maybe that was Scott afterwards, but we'll first Scott Just, I think, who was trying to. So Kim, go ahead first, and then Scott.
I clicked on the community isn't link, and I was kind of flipping through that a little bit as one of the activities. And I really like that because I feel like a lot of times when I talk about us being a community of learners, some kids don't always understand exactly what that is. And so I kind of like that as a strategy that I might implement at the beginning here.
Thank you so much, Kim. And we're going to take a little bit a look at highlighting some other things in there. And one of them is some ideas about discussing community. So thank you. And Scott, if I had that right, that you were next, please go ahead.
Okay. I'm sitting here with Nikki, Annika Rayford, the other from here.
Okay.
And we both use Pear Deck. She uses it more than I do. And I was playing on a Pear Deck. I like the moment of silence and having them think of 3 good things locally, in the world, in their life, in the community, and in the world, because God knows we could all use it at times, or they could use it with things going on.
Yeah. Thank you, Scott. Appreciate that. And thank you, Ken. And Stacy also in the chat box mentioned the "Don't Misunderstand Me" closing routine. And with middle school students at the beginning of the year could be a great idea, and to get some important insights into them and give them a space to voice some important truths about themselves. So thank you for all those comments. So if we could go through the next few slides a little quickly, Molly, I just want to give people some examples of other things that are in there. Contracting is something that was mentioned earlier in the day. Contracting for us refers to setting agreements about norms and how we talk to each other. Really important to have those conversations about how we're going to have difficult conversations before you find yourself in the middle of one, because then that's too late. So you want to have these routines, these agreements, these understandings done, and have an integral part of your community. And those conversations, if you remember back to the scope and sequence, can happen more easily when we're talking about ourselves, when we're talking about our identity. We can have some difficult conversations, but in general, as I'm sure you know, I'm a former 7th through 12th grade teacher. I have an 8th grader who's coming home from school, and we're having the "why are you being grounded" conversation today. So I know what it's like to teach and work with 8th graders, and how much it's just about them. And that's developmental. It's not because they're bad or selfish people necessarily. It's because that's where they are. And that's why it's a great way to meet them, is have these conversations about identity. How do we want to talk to each other, etc. So the next slide is a more example of starting with yourself as educators, infusing personal reflection and self-care into your practice, different prompts and action steps that are a part of the toolkit. Next slide, Molly. This is a way to begin this discussion about community, and anticipation guide is a great strategy we use in different ways, where you have different statements in response to a prompt. Students then do strongly agree, agree, disagree, strongly disagree. Sometimes that'll turn into a 4 corners exercise, where we'll literally have students stand up and represent their opinion in a corner and have discussions. But it's really great because it gets a spectrum of possibilities of, in this case, a definition of community out, so that students can hear the spectrum and then decide, oh, which one do I like and why? So the next slide goes into this a little bit more by giving a definition of community, asking students to journal about it. And the next slide is another resource in the Back to School Toolkit, exploring community in 3 ways, with symbols, main ideas, and a question, and different prompts going down in the rows to use those columns for. And as you'll see by clicking on it, all of these are available in Google Documents that you can download and edit, etc. So we have a lot that's available for free, including those. The next slide, Molly. Another example, community exit card. So things again on the way out the door where you can still have these routines where you're getting information, getting feedback, checking for understanding, checking for emotions as students are going out the door. And the next slide. Another one here, this idea about teach the teacher exit card. Again, more ways to communicate, more ways to connect with our students. And then I just want to share in this next slide, this is just a really great video. We're not going to watch it now, but these are two young women who were facing history students who ended up creating a project on cultural intimacy. And in this YouTube video, which is linked in the back to school toolkit, they talk about their identities, their specific identities, similarities and differences, and how their relationship didn't really deepen, didn't get to a really genuine place until they started having those uncomfortable conversations about their differences, about their identities, about the struggles that they share together, that they share separately. And they're just, both really lovely and uplifting voices to hear. So with all that said, I want to transition to looking in the last time that we have left here at the Reconstruction unit. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see that Reconstruction slide again. And, I think if we pause here for a second before we go forward to the next slide and just ask the question, why Reconstruction? Why study Reconstruction? Why is it important? And just everyone take 10 seconds to, think about how you would answer that question if you had to right now. Why study Reconstruction? And then if you go to the next slide, Molly, I just want to share some questions that build on that question about why study Reconstruction. And we're not going to do the choose one question thing on the side there. I'll just share here. So historian Eric Foner is basically sort of the preeminent Reconstruction historian. He wrote the book that's literally called Reconstruction, America's Unfinished Revolution. And he said that what he points out always is a question we need to ask is what debates and dilemmas from this era, from this time period of over 150 years ago, remain unresolved. And if we think back to that Baldwin quote, which we said we could substitute 1963 with 2022, sort of asking the same question, right? What haven't we dealt with as a country? What haven't we acknowledged? What haven't we addressed? And this time period, literally the definition of freedom was up for grabs. There was not a plan for Reconstruction put in place before Lincoln's assassination. He had a few ideas, 10% plan, which had 10% of the voting white males in the former states in the rebellion, if 10% of them agreed to vote. So he put some of these that they could come back into the Union. So he put some ideas, but there was no fully formed plan. So literally the definition of freedom, did it mean that you could work for wages? Did it mean that you were going to get land? What were the civil rights that freedom entailed you to? Were there any human rights or economic rights that freedom entailed? And then we need to think about whatever that definition of freedom, which if we look at a consensus of the scholarship, was basically this idea of free labor. Working for wages is what freedom ended up meaning in Reconstruction. Was that even fulfilled by this time period? When we think about the calamity, the trauma, the unbelievable drama, the impact that the Civil War had on our nation and almost everybody living in it at the time, after such a trauma and calamity, what do you do? Do you seek to have justice first in order to find peace? Do you need to have peace first in order to find justice? How do you heal? Can you do those two things at once? And were either of them done? Or what components of healing or what components of justice happened and not, and why? And again, back to this theme of the fragility of democracy. When we look at this era, we can learn a lot. And I also want to be honest, myself and the author of the book, my former colleague, Dan Sigward, who wrote the unit, we've had conversations about feeling that the title is no longer appropriate, that we talk about the fragility of democracy of a democracy that was actually never achieved. So how can we talk about it being fragile? And if you want to talk about it being fragile, where do you start? Do you start before the 1965 Voting Rights Act? And if you do, how can you justify that as a real democracy? Do you start before the 19th Amendment, giving women, white women at the time, the right to vote? And if you do, how do you justify that, talking about that as a real democracy? So, you know, these are paradigm shifts I think that we all need to have to be honest about this history. So I'd like to play a short video if possible, Molly. Actually, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and skip this. I would like to tell you there's a great video on the Facing History website. And Molly, if you could just click on it so that it goes to the page and people can see it, but we're not going to watch it now. It is very short. It does. Oh, I think that's one here. That's one of the updates to the slideshow that for some reason didn't come through.
Oh, here,
so I'm just going to,
let
No,
me
it's
just go out and go back in.
or I can just put the link in the chat
Okay,
box.
great.
Oh no, that's the wrong one. That is the link to the actual presentation. This is what I meant to do. Sorry, I was moving too fast. So that's to the slideshow. Don't do that. So this library, this video, Why Study Reconstruction, is something you might want to come back to. But also, if you scroll down, you'll see links to other resources in Reconstruction. And I will share a link to the whole collection at the end, where we have a whole collection of videos that I know are used at different points in the revised curriculum and are really well done. So if we can go to the next slide, thank you. So one of the things that's really important to think about, and that's represented in that journey again of identity and we and they, about how we enter this history. When you teach this history, when you teach any traumatic history, it's so important to address contracting, as we mentioned, but specifically about issues of race, about dehumanizing language in historical documents. There are primary sources in our unit that use the N-word because they are accurate sources from the time. And we felt it was important as historians or as a journalist to report accurately on what happens. However, in your classroom, we can't tell you what to do, but we can tell you need to slow down and think about it. What choices are you going to give your students? Are you going to allow them to read it if it exists in a historical document? Are you going to have them substitute things like the N-word or just skip it over? It's important for you to think about. It's important to have these discussions about identity and names. Think about the significance of names in general, the power of names. Think about the significance of names for over 4 million enslaved people who, in historical terms, not literally after 100, 200 years of struggle and resistance, but in historical times, went from a state of enslavement to freedom overnight, and to freedom that wasn't defined. Part of that was choosing their own names for a lot of them, of signing voter rolls for the first time and petitions and becoming active. So we looked at all these things, these ideas of we and they, an idea of the universal obligation and definitions of freedom before we enter the history. And so the next slide, please. So what I'd like to give you some time to do now, I'm guessing by reaction, unless it was something else, Aniki, that you might know this resource. And so for those of you who do, I'm sorry, but hopefully you can find something returning to it again that you didn't see the first time. But this is a letter from Jordan Anderson. It's titled, the subtitle is "A Freedman Writes His Former Master." And just to give you a little context, oh, that's great, Aniki. To give you a little context, what was lost to history was the letter from his former master. We don't have that. But apparently his former master wrote Jordan, who had left Tennessee to go to Ohio, and he asked him apparently to come back because Jordan is writing a response to that request to come back. One thing I'll say just to get it out there, this letter is accurate. There have been times in different groups where some people have questioned the authenticity, have asked me, how could a formerly enslaved person who didn't have an education write this letter? And there's two responses to that. One, even though formerly enslaved people did not have formal educations, were violently and legally denied formal educations, they were fully human. And this statement, which Dr. Hassan Kwame Jeffries is a scholar who we work with a lot, is somebody who really hammered this home in my own understanding. That statement's simple. They were fully human. But we think about the implications of that. It means formerly enslaved people before the Civil War were fully human. They were fully political thinkers, fully economic thinkers, social thinkers. They understood the nature of their enslavement. They understood the nature of their enslavers. And they set an agenda, a freedom agenda, even before the Civil War, so that in the moment of emancipation, there was an agenda for the modern civil rights movement that grew out of that full humanity, full struggle, and full resistance. It didn't just materialize out of nowhere. So with that said, it's been proven that this letter was dictated to a lawyer in Ohio. They found Jordan Anderson's grave. The letter was published in a contemporary newspaper a year or two later. So just give you that context. With that context, in a second, I'm going to ask you to go read it. Before we do that, we're not going to use the strategy here, but I just want to give you an example on the next slide of a great text-based, text-to-text, text-based discussion strategy that you could use. So if you could go to the next slide, Molly. Thank you. This is called the save the last word strategy. We're not going to do it, but I just again wanted to give you an example. In a class, you could break students into groups of 3, and they would read this, and each one selects a passage. You could ask them to select something they found surprising, interesting, troubling. You could have it be a passage with a specific question. You know, what does this letter tell you about the definition of freedom or the understanding of freedom that Jordan Anderson had? And each participant pulls a quote out in their small group. Then they each take turns sharing the quote without commentary. So A would just say, here's the quote I chose. B and C would have a turn to respond to it. And then it comes back to A, and they can say, oh, that's really interesting. You know, you saw that about the quote, you said this, I chose it because of this. And then you go through that process with the other folks in the small group. For us right now, we'll just take, again, about 5 minutes to go read the letter. And come back and have a wide open discussion about what stood out or what resonated in this letter for you. And yes, the PS is amazing. So the link is up there from me in the chat box, and you should have it. Please let me know if you have any trouble accessing it. And for the last time, I'll start my timer for 5 minutes. In about 2 more minutes, we'll come back. Just 1 more minute. All right, let's come back together. So again, it'd be great to hear from anyone that didn't have a chance to speak up yet. And just wide open, did anything resonate with you? You find anything particularly surprising, interesting, troubling about this primary source? And since it's a smaller group, I'll take off the caveat if you haven't spoken yet. So anybody can speak up.
One thing I noticed, my hometown is actually Dayton, Ohio, so that caught my eye right away. As far as the letter itself, the specifics on the economics of how much, he was making now versus the zero he was making before. And also kind of detailing the former or the slave owners' crimes. It was kind of like a expository letter on all the different wrongdoing he had done.
Thank you, Drew. I heard one professor point out about this letter that Jordan has a fully developed or demonstrates a fully developed understanding of the economic theory of the value of labor in this letter, right? Down to the dollars and cents. It's also evidence of the fact that reparations for enslavement, for lost wages, for lost capital, for lost accumulation of capital, were asked for, were part of this freedom agenda of Black Americans from the moment of emancipation. They're not something that's new. So thank you for that, Drew. Somebody else.
One thing that's kind of interesting is looking at inflation calculators. That's about $750,000.
Oh, thank you. So you actually just did look that up.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. And again, I think, I don't know if it's my age generation, but it seemed that when I was leaving college, I had hammered into me this idea of retirement, of compounded interest, that I needed to start saving right away because the interest would compound. And even if I was doing a little bit by the time I was this age, not quite, by the time I was a little older, hopefully, I'd have a lot of money to retire with. And why that notion is so easy for us to understand, while it's opposite, compounded deficits are a lot harder for us to understand. What does it mean for generational wealth to have a compounded deficit attached to a race or an identity? When we look at the housing policy in our country and redlining, some of the powerful stories that I've heard, we use a video series called Race, the Power of the Illusion. And in one episode, they tell this story of a Black American GI and a white American GI returning from World War II. The white family was able to have a federally subsidized mortgage, which allowed them to buy a house in Levittown, a suburban community development. And the Black American man, his family, veteran's family, was denied because of racial covenants built into the leases of Levittown, which explicitly said that only members of the Caucasian race could buy or be sold a home in Levittown. And in this video, they go into the development of that wealth, how the Levittown, the white family, was able to build equity, was able to build wealth, was able to finance the start of a business, finance children's college educations, and have generational compounded wealth built for them from a federal policy. And this is another thing to understand. It wasn't that there was a racist person necessarily who was saying yes to the white family and no to the Black family. There was a federal government policy. There was private institutions and businesses who had policies. There was Levittown who had it written into a covenant. And as Scott is saying in the chat, it was a systems issue. And that's one of the shifts we need to make. Yes, it is a systems issue, as Scott is also saying. And those are one of the shifts we need to make. Yes, it is bad when somebody is racist in their heart. But in the end, do we care if they're racist or not in their heart as much as what they do, as much as what they say, as much as what their actions do? So again, that's a shift I think our country is still wrestling with. It's not about the bad actors. It is a paradigm shift that you see in scholars who are trying to help us make this shift. It's not just that ignorant, bad, racist, evil people do their things, and then laws are written to codify their ignorance, their racism. If we look at history, it's more often the opposite. It's more often that laws and policies are made to justify existing inequalities that then, in a systemic way, replicate those beliefs and those racist impacts. So thank you very much for that. One more person, anyone want to share anything that resonated from the document?
I think it offers an opportunity too to include a voice in the classroom, like from the time, and it's like bright and witty and sardonic, and and these voices deserve to be heard too, right? So I think it's an opportunity. It's one of those things where you're teaching content, and this is part of the content too, is humanizing folks in history. And it's an opportunity to teach kids how to read this like a historian, why documents like this matter. Your point about people oh, how could this be real? It'd be a great opportunity for sourcing. The Smithsonian Magazine wrote an article about that, and it addresses that. It's nope, we sourced it, and here's where it is. In a Cincinnati newspaper. So you could even lay out the breadcrumbs for kids to look at it. So I think it has so much. It's worth spending the time on. It offers so much.
Thank you, Stacy. And I've once read this in an auditorium with people, and was handing it out down the rows. And as I was going up, you could hear like laughter. You know, this row would read something and laugh, and then this row would read it. And then at the end, you hear people who are doing a lot of sighing, because yes, it's sardonic and witty, but without very much reading between the lines, it's incredibly painful and represents the trauma of incredible violence when he mentions his daughters, when he mentions being shot at, you know, on and on. So it's effective in that way of communicating realities of history. If we could go to the next slide, Molly, just a couple more of examples of resources before we close. So this is just another example, I think, really building on what Stacy said about why these voices are important in the stories. One lesson we have takes a look at two white women, one from the North and one from the South. Kate Stone from Brookline, Massachusetts, who's the bells, you know, it's after the Civil War, the surrender, the bells are ringing, you know, it's amazing. And the other woman, Carolyn Barrett White, who escaped from Louisiana before it fell to the Union Army with her enslaved people to Texas, where enslavers were protected for much longer. And she literally says, we are the slaves now. We will be the ones who are oppressed. We were the, and how, you know, how could she do that? How could a white woman enslaver say, now we're the enslaved ones? Well, that's hard for us to understand, I hope. It's hard to understand perpetrator behavior. And it's really hard because we don't want to excuse it. We don't want to justify it. We don't want to rationalize it away. But the truth is, if we want to prevent violence and hatred, we have to understand perpetrator behavior. And that's difficult. It's much easier for us to relate to victims just on a human level, much easier for us to see ourselves as rescuers. We all want to be the person who, in the moment, would do the right thing and save people. And, you know, and the adolescents who want to, you know, biff, bow, Pam, and, you know, rescue everybody. But we need to look at them not as crazy, evil outliers of humanity, but fully human people as well, who made choices that had consequences. And if we want to prevent hatred, violence, we do have to understand that. So just on the next page, a couple last things to share. This is the link to the full sort of resource collection on the Facing History website. You'll see on the left, there's a link to 7 different videos. They're very short one, slightly longer ones, about 10 minutes long, that go into some of the major themes that we look at. There are video lessons that use those lessons, and other links for sources there. You know, I think right now we are here about Reconstruction, but as Stacy and Molly have mentioned, there's a lot else that may be applicable for your teaching. So on the next page, just to give you a little window, again, I don't want to go too much into it, but as I mentioned, there's more that are sort of pedagogically focused as opposed to content-based. So one on community matters, on current events in your classroom, from reflection to action, a choosing to participate toolkit. And then just the general tab of educator resources. There's a great starting point to serve so much. And then the next slide, just again, a little look into some of the current events work that we do and the themes that we look at, tying current events to these topics. So I'll stop there and just, you know, again, say how excited I am to be any part of this work. And, you know, I'm really excited for us to continue the conversation and planning with Molly, Stacy, and Chris about the workshop that we'll be doing in the spring, about choosing that date, as Molly mentioned, about the follow-up support that we'll share that we can provide during that time. And just please note that you can reach out to me at any time. By the end of the day, by the end of the week, my colleague, my assistant, Will Lindy, will be able to share a resource document from today's session with you that has links to every single resource that I used, as well as some other things that would be important for you to have. And it'll have my email address on there. And I really look forward to continuing the work with you, Molly and Stacy, and with all the fabulous educators you're working with. So thank you.
Sorry, I'm just swapping my screens over. Thanks, Jeremy. And like Stacy just said in the chat, we will make sure to put that that resource list out when we send the recording as well. All right, so because now we only have 6 minutes. Here's what we want to leave you with. The first thing is this is the link for the slide deck from today. So if you want to go ahead and actually Stacy's going to drop it in the chat, that'll give you access to this whole slide deck in case there's anything else you'd like to go back to. And again, everything is hyperlinked within it. So if you didn't have a chance to save all the links we were dropping in, they're in there. And we'll also send the link to the slide deck with the recording as well as soon as the recording processes and we can get it out. So our next meeting is September 22nd. So it seems far away, but I have a feeling it'll be here before we know it. And that one is going to start our normal routine, which is the after school 4:30 to 6 p.m. on Zoom. And at that one, we'll preview Unit 2 and kind of like just dive right into Unit 2 and give you a chance to preview it and take a look at what's coming up. And also to talk a little with each other about how Unit 1 is going. And for us to answer any questions you have. So if you had friends who couldn't make it today, obviously, remind them to register for that session. And just a reminder, you do have to register for each session individually. So when you go back to that SMORE link, just make sure you click to register for the next session. And this is just giving you, and I'm going to stay on in a second. I'll stop the recording and I'll just stay on if you have any questions you want to chat about. But also this is my email. Which Stacy, I think will put in the chat for me as well. So as you're starting to look through Unit 1 and as you're getting going this year, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. We're also here to help. So if you're coming up on a lesson plan and you want some extra support in your classroom, reach out to us and we will do our best to be there for you to help you teach a lesson that you're concerned about, or you want to see how it rolls and you just feel like you need an extra adult in the room. We're here to help you. So those are our emails. Please don't hesitate to reach out, and thank you for spending 3 hours with us. You guys have been great and we're excited to get this series launched.
Thank you. This was very helpful.